Good morning. I'd like to welcome y'all, and my name's Bud Giesinger. I'm president of the TriCities chapter, and I'm glad all y'all could make it out this morning. And I know a lot of y'all are probably dying to get back into your routine, and hopefully we can have a great program this morning and get us focused on things, and it's things that are important to our business, and move on with what's going on. I would be remiss to not spend a minute to talk about a little bit about what's happened in our community in the last few weeks, and also talk a little bit, it kind of lines up with our program this morning actually, but talk about what's happened, especially with our corporate citizens in Houston. I think, again, it's time after time, whether it's Ike, Allison, whatever we have in this city, there's nothing steps up like our corporate citizens. And the last few weeks, I think we've seen that in spades, more than any time I can remember. And I've been around this town for a long time, and I've seen a lot of people step up, but this goes beyond it. And it's not just financial and all the contributions that have been made by the fine corporate citizens we have in Houston, but it's also rolling up your sleeves. Someone was telling me they were down at George R. Brown, and they said if you wanted to see every CEO in Houston, you just needed to go downtown, because they were down there with their sleeves rolled up and helping not only their employees and the people from their companies, but everybody in the city. And I know I'm speaking to a lot of leaders in this room, people that lead companies and are stewards of our corporate world, and I'd just like to personally say thank you for stepping up again. Hopefully this will be the, yes, clap. You know, the best we can tally, our corporate world in Houston has donated over about $160 million in the last few weeks. You know, if you take a company like Conoco, they did $5 million alone, $2.5 million to the Red Cross and $2.5 million to United Way. People like Conoco gave $50,000 low-interest loans and grants, interest-free low-loan grants to their employees. You know, Anadarko, LyondellBasell, Phillips 66, Cisco, Waste Management, the true pillars of our community, stepped up time and time again. I hate to mention a few because all of y'all could probably come up here and talk about what your organization did or an organization that you're really close to, but it really says a lot for Houston, and I think the world has taken notice of what happened in this city in the last few weeks. So while, you know, corporate America gets beat up a lot, I think what's happened in the last few days really speaks a lot and will probably go a long way in getting our city back on its feet. We've got a long ways to go, but I think with the people that we have in this town, we're going to be fine. So I'm going to ask Laura Nickel to come up. Laura is our program chairman for the chapter, and she will kick off our program. And Laura, I can just say with our topic this morning, your foresight is amazing. Our program committee plans these things obviously months out, sometimes a year out, but with what we're covering this morning, it kind of fits in well with what we've been experiencing. So, Laura?
Yes, thank you. I'll go ahead and welcome Alan and Raj. You want to come on up to the stage? I want to introduce our wonderful two directors and thought leaders that are with us today. As a program committee, we've been thinking long and hard about the most valuable learning and education that we as directors can have, and a focus on long-term value creation is what we're going to be talking about throughout the fall. And we couldn't have two better thought leaders to help us talk through that today. Our moderator, Alan Crane, is a well-known advisor to Fortune 500 companies. Most recently, he was the chief legal officer for Baker Hughes, and he's on the board of, his bio is in the package, on the board of EP Energy. And then our guest, Raj Sisodia, is the Olin Distinguished Professor of Global Business and Whole Foods Market Research Scholar in Conscious Capitalism at Babson College. It's a mouthful. A wonderful thought leader in marketing, having studied this over the years and studied trends of successful companies. He's on the board of Container Store and advisor to many CEOs, teams, and boards that want to take their companies to a different level. So I cannot tell you how much you're going to enjoy this conversation. It's going to be inspiring and at just the right time in our city when so many of us are thinking about how to consciously lead.
Well, thank you all for being here with the storm and the challenges of that. And particularly, Raj, thank you for being here. So I want to ask Raj to give us the elevator speech version. We're going to go into a lot of detail on conscious capitalism. But they give us the elevator speech, and then there's another part I've asked him to emphasize at the start. So thank you and welcome for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Can you hear me all right? It really is a momentous time. I know in this city I had some trepidation coming. I said, I wonder how it's going to be. I know, but I've been heartened and really inspired by the stories I've heard and the way people have come together. So it really is incredible. It reminds me of what happened in Boston after the bombing attack on the marathon. You know, it really brought people together. So there is some silver lining to these kinds of things. You know, conscious capitalism is an idea and a movement that started roughly 10 years ago. Actually, 2008, I think, was our real starting point. The basic idea is that we need to have a richer and deeper narrative about business than the one that currently exists, because the story that we tell about business is not very inspiring, and it's not, in fact, even accurate in describing what great companies truly are. And so it addresses, and we'll go into detail on this, it addresses all the big questions about why do we exist as a business. And we're going to talk about how it goes beyond making money. We need to make money, obviously, to survive and grow. But it's just like everybody in this room, we all need to make money to live. But hopefully that's not our purpose in life. Money is a means to an end. Profits also are a means to an end. So we talk about why the business exists. What do we do as a business? What kinds of value do we create? And how do we do it? What are the cultures in which we operate? And all of these have different answers when you talk about conscious business. You know, there's a different way of thinking about each of those elements. So we will get into that. And actually, it's about doing business with a spectrum of positive effects, and without the trade-offs, and without the so-called externalities and negative side effects that come with just focusing on one thing, just making money. So there's a way to do it in a much richer, broader, and deeper way. And it's actually something that's truly does create a situation in which everybody can win. Through business, because business has extraordinary power, but I don't think we've realized all of the potential that actually exists in business and capitalism.
So we want to talk about that at some length, but since you mentioned money, and we have lots of old school directors here, not myself, but lots of old school directors. Let's talk a little bit about money first, and then come back to the tenets of conscious capitalism.
Yeah, so you know, it's interesting that these businesses, I would say almost without exception, not one of them will get up and say we're all about maximizing profits or maximizing shareholder value. That is not their stated purpose. They obviously want to be successful companies, and they are. But if you look at the outcomes of operating in this way, and we'll get into the definition of this, my research that got me into this whole area was by working on a book called Firms of Endearment. The first edition came out 2007. And at the time, it started out as a marketing book, actually, because I had done a lot of work in marketing showing that we're spending a lot of money and not getting good outcomes. In fact, spending had gone up year after year for 50 years on marketing, and customer loyalty and trust had fallen almost continuously over those 50 years on average.
And Raj is one of the world's foremost experts and has been recognized as such on marketing. So when he speaks of this, and this is a great book too, and we'll talk more about how wonderful this book is, and you have to read it. I've read it 3 times. And mine's all marked up. That's why I brought one of these up.
That's more than I've read it. But this is kind of the book that got me into that, And what really startled me at that time when we started this project in 2005, in the US, we spent $1 trillion on marketing that year, $1,000 billion. That was the GDP of India that year. Okay, so just think about that. 1.1 billion people were living on what we were spending here, mostly on ads and coupons and sales and all the sort of the promotional and somewhat gimmicky aspects of marketing, and what were we getting for that? So I started a project saying most companies spend a lot of money and yet customer loyalty and trust are low and falling even as we spend more. Which are the companies that are the opposite of that spend very little and yet have outstanding customer loyalty and trust? What are they doing? They must be doing something right. And we found indeed they were doing a whole bunch of things right, but it wasn't limited to marketing. In fact, marketing was almost an afterthought at these companies. Whole Foods at that time was spending 90% less than the industry average. And 90% of what they spent was at the store level, 90% of that was in their communities. And yet they had some of the most outstanding customer loyalty and trust. So we found that to be true in a lot of these companies, but also their employees were loyal and trusting. Their suppliers had long-term partnerships with them. Communities embraced them and and welcome them. So they were stakeholder oriented. We'll get all of the pillars of conscious capitalism were part of that. And at the end of identifying a set of such companies, in the original book, 28 of them, 18 public and 10 private. Second edition, we addressed one of the criticisms, which is that the research wasn't broadly based enough and didn't use enough data, it was more case study driven. So this time we had data on 1,000 companies, 65 pieces of information relating to all the stakeholders as well as environmental, social, and governance type of things. And from that screen, we ultimately narrowed it down to 72 companies, of which 29 are US public companies. I think 28 are US private companies, and the rest are international. And then at the end of that analysis, we did the financials to say, okay, these companies, since they're not explicitly and exclusively focused just on profit maximization, maybe their financial results aren't that great. But they are creating many other kinds of value. But what we actually found really stunned us, because over a long term, what did I press? Oh, I went too far. This is tricky, bud. Okay. Over the long term, these companies dramatically outperform the market. So in the original book, it was 9-1 over a 10-year period. And then we got 5, 10, and 15 years here. And we're going to update this as of 2013. We're getting the new numbers soon. But in the long term, these companies create dramatically more shareholder value, while at the same time, they are focused on creating value for customers, for employees, for communities, for even the families of employees, investing in the environment and so forth, right? It's not a trade-off. It's not a choice between saying we can either be good for the world or we can make a lot of money. There is a way to make money that aligns with creating value for everybody you touch. And when you do that in the long term, there's a lot more financial value, but that's not the only kind. We talk about 8 kinds of wealth that businesses can create or destroy. It's financial, it's intellectual capital, it's social capital. The amount of trust and cohesion in this community is going to go up based on the way business community responds. It's the impact on the culture, what constitutes a good life through our marketing, advertising, and other things. It's the impact on people's emotional state, operating from love and care versus fear and stress. It's the impact on people's spiritual well-being, having meaning and purpose in their life through their work. It's the impact on our bodies, it's the impact on the environment. These are all the consequences of the way in which we operate. And these businesses seek to have a positive impact in all those areas. And traditional businesses might say it's all about making money, as we know, and everything else that happens is a side effect. And as you know, side effects tend to be negative, right? The reality is there's no such thing called a side effect. We do things and there are a bunch of effects. If you focus on all of those effects as being important, just because you call something a side effect doesn't make it less important. So it's possible to do that. These companies are trying to do that, and it is working. But as I said, financially also, it's a pretty dramatic story. And we can get into why that is. This kind of seems kind of odd that this would be the case, but there are some very, very good reasons why, in fact, there's outperformance in the long term.
And I've seen this for years, and Raj and I have discussed this, but thinking of what Bud mentioned today about the Houstonian involvement, all of us know HEB. HEB is owned by Charles Butt, so it's a private company. But they have, and if you haven't seen this, send me an email and I'll send it to you. My email is arc1917@gmail. That's the one where all the junk email goes. No, that's arc1917. But there's a great presentation that somebody did about what HEB has done in connection with the hurricane and the flooding. And these are trucks that they have, the people they've moved over immediately from all around the country to come and serve, the relationship they have with suppliers. And I know I've never talked to Charles yet about conscious capitalism, but I know that he lives and breathes this. More than a quarter century ago, when he opened Central Market, I took our vice president of human resources over there. I said, I want you to go there, opening that food store next door to our office. He said, why do you want me to go? And I said, because I think somebody will be there. And I walked up, and there were about 40 people outside that had little stick-on name tags, pre-printed, hi, my name is, and then handwritten, Charles. And Charles doesn't like to be praised, so don't tell him I told you all this. But there he was, just like anybody else, welcome to Central Market, welcome to Central Market. And I took our vice president of human resources over, and I said, Charles, whenever I go in an HEB store, your employees seem the happiest, and I started in retail. How do you make that happen? And he gave me the same look my Labrador gives me at times. Cocked his head like I wasn't very smart, and he was right about that. And he said, Alan, you've got to love them. And he means it. And Raj will talk more about that. And we all know HEB is very, very successful. And there's a guy who's worth, I don't know how much, more than $10 billion, standing out there shaking hands with every other employee just like he's any other employee. And he cares about things. And this is what can happen. And Raj, why don't we go to the next slide? Why don't you get more into this?
The four pillars or tenets of conscious capitalism are pretty straightforward. It starts with having a purpose, a higher purpose for the business that is separate from profit. Money is important. It is a measure of our success or measure of our functioning. It is an objective, certainly, for the business. You cannot survive and grow and have the impact that you want to have in the world unless you're profitable and growing. But it is not the purpose. It's like saying that I need red blood cells in order to live, but I shouldn't dedicate my life to producing as many red blood cells as possible. The question is, what am I going to do with those red blood cells, right? What are we as individuals going to do with the money, which is just a form of embodied energy? It's a means to an end. And what is the highest and ultimate end? I love the way Herb Kelleher puts it. He said, the business of business is people. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And for my money, he's the most conscious leader I've ever met. The greatest American leader of any business that I've come across, and embodies all of these qualities. So having a higher purpose, just as individuals do, I use the analogy often of a caterpillar and a butterfly. We can either live our life at a caterpillar level, which all a caterpillar does is essentially consume, right? Or we can evolve to that higher plane of consciousness, which that creature does evolve to automatically, the butterfly, right? Which not only is a creature of light and beauty, but also creates flourishing in the system in which it exists through cross-pollination, right? And we as individuals, as well as these entities that we create as organizations of any kind, also have their own journey of rising consciousness. And when we evolve to that higher plane, there is a purpose that we discover that what our life is about. As they say, what the two most important days in your life, the day you're born and then the day you understand why you were born. I think Mark Twain may have said that, or Yogi Berra, I'm not sure. So a higher purpose. And for each of these, I love acronyms. So I've got an acronym that says it's about healing. We live in a world of extraordinary suffering. And of course, we don't have to remind each other of that in this moment, but certainly it's true all the time, even when there are no hurricanes. There's extraordinary pain and suffering on this planet, unimaginable amounts every day. It'll break your heart if you just think about it. And if we individually and organizationally are not part of the healing, we may be part of the hurting. And there's a lot of silent suffering out there. There's a lot of pain, even for people with full-time jobs. So can we as a business be consciously part of the healing? Can we, in fact, alleviate suffering and bring more joy through whatever it is that we choose to do? Whatever our focus is, doesn't matter what our business is, it can be an instrument of alleviating suffering and bringing more joy, which is what I talk about healing. But it also stands for the qualities of a great purpose, which is heroic. It's trying to do something meaningful that needs to be done and is worth doing. It evolves. It aligns all of your stakeholders together. Because when you have a shared purpose, now you're all literally have a shared journey. Otherwise, you're literally at cross purposes. When you say, I'm only about making money, well, customers are only about getting the lowest price, and suppliers are only about cutting their costs and getting the highest price, and employees are about working as little and getting paid as much, and society is all about taxing you as much as possible and taking from you. Everybody becomes a taker from the system when you just focus on money as the only measure. But when you have a shared higher purpose, everybody is, as we say, in order to win, you have to give into that system. And the more you give, of course, as we know, the more we receive from that entity. Otherwise, we just bleed it dry. So it's aligning. It's rooted in love and care. And that's a common element you'll hear a lot about. It's inspiring. It gets people out of bed in the morning. It's not just I have a job. I have got work to do. There's a reason why. I don't say, thank God it's Friday. I actually look forward to getting to work and doing what I'm doing, which is meaningful to me and to the world.
Raj, in your book, you've got some statistics on, of course, across corporate America. How many people that are employees are really engaged?
Well, it's only 30% in the US, which is the highest in the world, by the way. Okay, but only 30% of our people are engaged in their work. 50% are indifferent and 20% hate it. Okay? It's like you've got a boat with 10 people who are supposed to be rowing, and 3 are, and 5 are skimming the surface, and 2 are hitting other people over the head with their paddles, right? You're not going to get very far or fast. But that's a sad state of affairs. Worldwide, it's only 13%, 13. Japan is only 7% employee engagement. Think about the extraordinary waste of human potential and human lives, not leaving aside the financial impact, which is $560 billion in the U.S. alone every year. We only have this one life to live, unless you come from India. We got many. And we only have about 100,000 hours to work. And work can be a source for human beings. As Freud said, love and work are the cornerstones of what it means to be a human. And for most of us, that work is devoid of meaning. It's just a way to make a living. And we look for meaning and purpose, hopefully, in the world and through our families. But work can be a deep source of meaning and fulfillment, and it isn't for most people. So the last two are natural and galvanizing. It moves you to action. So that's purpose, right? And that's kind of where it starts. It's why. The second element is, this thing likes to move, stakeholder integration. So we want to think about all of the stakeholders as a collective, because they are interconnected and interdependent. Anything you do with any one of them is going to impact all of them, immediately or eventually. You do something with your employees, it's going to impact your customers. It's going to obviously impact your investors ultimately. Likewise with any of them. So they're interconnected, interdependent. We must understand how the whole thing works together as a system. But also we have to consciously focus on creating value for each of them and treat each of them not as a means to an end, but an end in themselves. The traditional way is that the end is to make money, and therefore employees and suppliers, they're all kind of necessary elements for us to make money. But they are just a means. We treat people as objects and functions, right? Not as precious human beings whose well-being is inherently important. We want our people to be happy and fulfilled, not just because they're more productive and innovative, but because they're people, and that's what life should be, right? So we look at each of them as an end. So all these stakeholders are means and ends at the same time. Each of them enables the value creation in the system, and each of them is one of the ends for that system to create value for. And it stands for, and I say, why SPICE? Why did I use this acronym? Well, as I said, as I come from India, right? And everything has spice, right? What is life without spice? Why did this country get discovered? What was Columbus looking for? But it stands for the stakeholders, I think, in the right order. It starts with society. It's society, partners, investors, customers, employees, and the environment. Okay? And you have to start with society. You have to be on the right side of society. We cannot be part of the problem. Any business that at some level is part of the problem, that's, I'm sorry, not a business. Okay? That's a parasite. We have to be part of the solution. In other words, the world is better off because we are here. We're not extracting value, we're creating value. Okay? And I believe that, unfortunately, there are too many businesses which operate with this low level of consciousness. It's only about profit, and profit equals revenue minus cost, and maximize revenue, minimize cost, sell as much, charge as much, whether people need it or not, whether it's good for them or not, minimize cost, pay people as little, squeeze your suppliers, externalize burdens onto society, push things into the future, pollute. That's not a business. That is extracting value, right? So again, society is, I believe, the first stakeholder. And then partners, investors, customers, employees. So you kind of design the business from the outside in, have your purpose that aligns with what's necessary in the world, and then bring the partners in that you need to create that, get the investors, create the value for customers, hire the people for whom their personal passion aligns with that, right? But then you run it from the inside out. You design it from the outside in, but then you start with your people. It starts really, your first stakeholders are your people. And if they're not well looked after, they're not cared for, then nothing else really ultimately happens or even matters. Right? So I have to start closest to that.
And I guess, Raj, if to restate, if your people don't identify with your purpose, then you don't have the right people. Because if they identify with your purpose, they'll be more engaged.
Right.
You get that symbiosis that allows you to get the benefit of their engagement. Your customers get the benefit of that engagement, and you get the financial returns because they're performing at a different level.
That's right. So you need congruence. So, if I'm a foodie and I care about health, going to work at Whole Foods doesn't even feel like work, right? And if I'm an outdoor enthusiast and I love to go hiking and camping and so forth, I work at REI, whose purpose is to reconnect people with nature, well, my work is an extension of who I am, right? So it's not just a job or even a career, it's a calling. Like if I win the lottery on Friday, I'll still show up on Monday because the work has meaning beyond the paycheck. So ideally it's not about good people or bad people, it's about people whose values and priorities and their natures, it all aligns with what this business is about.
And I agree, if I win the lottery, but I'd show up on Tuesday.
Take a day off.
Be a little hungover. But, you have a great example in your book of Pedigree, which was a company doing dog food, putting wet dog food in cans, dry dog food in bags.
Right.
How did they change by doing this?
Well, there are many other dog companies, and everybody makes all that stuff, and it's like there's no passion behind it, and there's no real differentiation and so forth. And ultimately, they really asked that hard question: why do we exist? Why are we here? And ultimately, it was the love of dogs. We're about dogs, and they created, I think they called their dogma. They stated it. We're about dogs, and they had a manifesto about dogs and how much they love dogs and how much dogs do for us and what's it all about and why we want to be here. And so it then went way beyond just the food. Right? So every employee now has a business card that has a picture of their own dog on it, and their workplace is completely dog friendly and filled with dogs. And now they have dog adoption places, and they do all kinds of things now for dogs because they've broadened their purpose. It's not just about putting dry stuff and wet stuff into containers, but it's about really taking care of these creatures who love us unconditionally and how much it means in our lives. So that creates a whole deep reservoir of energy and feeling and motivation and inspiration that simply doesn't exist. Very few people get up excited to go to work saying, I'm going to help create more shareholder value today. Okay? That may be the outcome of doing things, but that's not inherently, unless they're sitting on 1 million stock options about to expire, that's not inherently motivating to the vast majority of people. Right? And as we know, most companies, they don't widely distribute stock options. The top 5 people get 75% of the stock options in typical public companies. At Whole Foods, the last time I looked, 93% of the stock went to rank and file. In other words, ordinary employees, cashiers, and others. 7% went to the top 25 executives. Right? So it's widely dispersed. They're all sharing in that wealth creation, which, by the way, Whole Foods, by the time it got acquired by Amazon, returned 4,600% to its investors since they went public. Okay? So it's not that, as I said earlier, this is not about making money or creating wealth versus doing any of this. So that's the second piece, the stakeholders. And of course, important to point out, shareholders are a very important stakeholder, but they are part of the whole system. They're not the only one, and their well-being is connected with everybody else's. The third is leadership. Now, you cannot have a conscious business without conscious leaders. And you cannot be a conscious leader unless you're a conscious human being, which means you're operating at a level which is not just about yourself and your ego and your power and your enrichment, right, and your own agenda. So the acronym here is selfless. A conscious leader has to be selfless. You cannot be a great leader and be a selfish human being. Because if you are about using other people to achieve your personal objectives, then that is the very definition of a tyrant. That is not a leader. A leader is somebody who helps us create a vision and helps us all get there collectively by utilizing our capacities. Peter Drucker has a great quote. He said, only 3 things happen naturally in organizations: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Everything else takes leadership. You can put the most brilliant people, well-intentioned, good people in the room. Come back a few hours later, you'll find friction, confusion, underperformance. Until somebody steps into the mantle of leadership, the awesome responsibility, not privilege, responsibility of leadership. To again help create that vision and a strategy and a plan for how do we get there. Right? So you have to transcend the self. There's a state of being which goes beyond self-actualization, which is self-transcendence, which is a broader definition of self. It's the collective self. We're all interconnected. We're all interdependent. Humanity is one spirit at the end of the day. So how do I serve that collective? Right? And it then stands for the qualities of a great leader, starting with strength. You have to have tremendous strength as a leader, including resilience and courage and ability to stand up to all the obstacles and challenges. You have to have energy and enthusiasm. You have to have a long-term orientation. A leader cannot be focused on the next quarter, the next year, the next 5 years, their tenure as a CEO, or even the next decade. You have to think about the future writ large. There used to be a tradition in some Native American tribes about looking 7 generations ahead on every decision that a chief makes. Right? You have to think about the real long term and what the consequences are. Flexibility. Rooted in love and care, again, emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, and systems intelligence. These are some of the qualities, and you'll see in there a blend of what we would call masculine and feminine. So this is one of the big things. My last book was actually about that, called Shakti Leadership, which is about bringing or integrating feminine and masculine qualities in leadership. Because for too long, for all of human history essentially, every institution has been run by men based on a limited set of masculine values. And those are domination, aggression, ambition, winning, results at all costs, short-term thinking. Everything almost like a form of war. Right? We create these war on poverty and war on this and war on that. I mean, that's not the way really to solve problems, right? But that's the mentality that we've had about leadership. And a lot of it in the world of business comes because we had, the military were the only large organizations that existed in the 19th century, and so corporations got modeled after armies. Command and control, hierarchy, strategy, tactics, operations, front lines, headquarters, these are all terminologies that come from the military. And with that came the mindset as well. And what we're realizing is that we have left out some extremely critical human qualities: nurturing, caring, compassion, relationships, empathy, vulnerability. These are all as qualities that all of us have. They're labeled so-called feminine and masculine, but the fact is they're all within all of us. But they have been systematically suppressed and sidelined. For men and women, really. The feminine has been undervalued. So if you think about it, in the last couple of hundred years, the 19th century was about the end of slavery. The 20th was about the end of totalitarianism. And the 21st, I believe, will be about the end of the sidelining of the feminine and women, which has existed in human history forever. And it's like the bird of humanity has been flying with one wing tied behind its back for all this time, and the masculine wing has had to become violent and aggressive almost in order to keep us afloat. But now we can unfurl that other wing. Humanity can soar when women step into leadership, but also men are free to show up as whole human beings, to have nurturing, caring, and compassion, be part of their repertoire as well. So the summary phrase that my co-author came up with for that last book is that a conscious leader is a wise fool of tough love. You're wise, you're connected to your higher self, and we all have access to that. But you're also connected to your child self. You have the ability to be lighthearted and playful. That's where creativity comes from. Right? If you lose that, you lose all your creativity and fun. And tough and love. So you can be tough as needed in a given situation, but you can also be loving. And you have all of that within you. In other words, we have to become whole. We are fragmented. Most of us only have access to some parts of that. We are always tough, and we're always operating out of that wisdom. But we also need to learn the other. So how do we create that wholeness within us? And then how do we have the ability to discern, in this situation, I need to show up with more of a light touch. Or in this situation, I need to actually show up with some toughness, right? So having the flexibility then to be able to bring that kind of leadership in that situation.
So, and Raj, this really struck me. We all know the leader's so important. And as you say of your tenets, it's the key important one. And we also have seen reports about the studies that show that the incidence of psychopaths as CEOs is 12 times as high as in the general population. So we all know
that study. Wow.
I'll give you some information. We all know about individuals who are great actors and convince people of anything, but they really care mostly about getting rich at any cost. And they'll say or do anything. So as somebody who's on a nominating governance committee, understanding your leaders, understanding all the leaders in the organization and what the culture really is, and Raj is going to move to culture, is so important. Because I've seen leaders who frankly claim they do all these things and don't at all. And the board's none the wiser. The board is none the wiser. If you don't really know the leader, if you don't really know the second and third layers down in the tiers, and conscious capitalism supports the board doing the things they need to do to really know what's going on in the organization. I've spoken at the NACD twice, at the spring meeting, at the annual meeting, about asymmetric information risk. And I don't want to talk about that because this is what Raj is doing, but we really need to understand, and I know when Raj speaks about this, it may sound too philosophical for some of you. I'm an engineer, okay? I'm an engineer. Think how basic that is in terms of things. This is a very compelling, incredibly comprehensive, and well-balanced presentation as to how you can change not just what your company does and why they'll meet those I asked Raj to put the financial numbers up first because they're so compelling. Appendix A has more on that. Not only will your company make more money, but you'll be doing something that is so good for society and sustainability for your business. I mean, this is a balance of positivism. It's something I haven't seen to this level.
Thank you.
Excuse me for interrupting.
No, not at all. By the way, in your packet, you're going to find this one-page thing called the Conscious Business Summary Audit. It's 20 questions that you can actually go through with your team or with your board or with your leaders and get a very quick snapshot of where we are. And these are some tough questions. I mean, if you answer them honestly, you will know exactly where you stand on this spectrum. So that's for later. But by the way, we also do have a follow-up to this book coming out in April. It's called the Conscious Capitalism Field Guide, Tools for Transforming Your Organization. So it is about actually how to do all this stuff. How do you start from where you are, understanding where you are, and then what do you do first and how do you do it?
Let me just say, if you have, there's these little question sheets on your table. If you have a question, write it out at any time. As you can see, Pam will spot you if you hold it up, and she'll bring it up to me so we can get your questions in before we run out of time, because we could speak all day about this, and you would want to listen all day, but we won't.
Okay, so let me wrap up. The fourth tenet is culture. Again, Drucker, and this has almost become a cliche now, Drucker said culture eats strategy for breakfast. I don't know if you've heard that, or lunch. Strategy obviously matters, but every MBA student in this country knows the strategy of every great company, almost. They know how Southwest Airlines and Starbucks and Whole Foods and Costco and Google are. You know the strategy. It's not a secret, right? You could leave your strategic plan on the plane and nothing would happen, right? It's the culture that you cannot replicate. So what is the culture? It's something that does exist, how we do things, what are the unwritten rules, the norms, the shared values, the beliefs, the artifacts, that reflect that culture. And these companies are very conscious about that, and these cultures are pretty specific in terms of what they embody, and the qualities there are captured in that acronym tactile. Now, tactile is something you can look and feel, right? You can touch almost, right? And the culture, even though it's kind of an intangible thing, you can feel it. You walk into a conscious business, you walk into the Googleplex, you're going to feel the energy. You go to Southwest Airlines headquarters, feel the love. And that's their stock market symbol, right? LUV. Right? The walls are plastered with pictures of people with Herb Kelleher and with Colleen Barrett, right? Hugging, and their families and their children and so forth. So the culture is very tangible. And it stands for, the word actually stands for the quality, which is trust. It's built on a lot of trust, which is not present in most normal cultures. Authenticity, caring, again, that love and care. These are businesses that are built on caring for people as human beings. Transparency, integrity, learning, and empowerment. So these are some of the common qualities that we find in conscious cultures. Most cultures are built on a lot of fear and stress. We use this metaphor of carrots and sticks to motivate people, right? Now think about it. What animal belongs between a carrot and a stick? It's a jackass, right? I was in Aspen last year, went to a rodeo for the first time, and they had this thing where a bunch of donkeys were lined up and they were trying to get them to the other end of the field, trying every possible thing, right? And not easy. But we use that as a metaphor for human beings. You can perhaps get people to move a little bit by threatening them with getting fired or by putting a bonus in front of them. But research shows that for any kind of work that requires any kind of creativity, that actually has a negative impact. It's a wonderful book by Dan Pink called Drive, The Truth About What Really Motivates Us. It's autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right? Are the elements that really get people inspired. By the way, Dan is speaking at our Conscious Capitalism CEO Summit coming up October 10, 11, 12. It's not an advertisement, just an announcement to let you know. About 225 CEOs. It's limited to that, above a certain size, and happening in Austin every year in October. So, so again, as I said, what do we have in our typical environment? Very few people are engaged. 88% of people feel they work for a company that doesn't care about them as human beings, right? We say, thank God it's Friday, because we can't wait for the work week to get over and we live our life outside of work. And then what happens? Monday comes around again. Heart attacks go up 20% on Monday morning. I was told by a doctor at one of the hospitals in Boston, she said, yeah, it's 4 a.m. 4 a.m. Monday morning is the peak of heart attacks. Stress levels shoot up, connected to work. Our work is literally killing us. Okay? We're actually living in a very peaceful time. I mean, if you look at overall violence in the world, is way down, believe it or not. Wars, terrorists, murders, even another thing. I mean, that is all dramatically down, even though it doesn't feel like that. But our work is literally killing us now. It's become the single biggest killer. Stress. Most chronic disease is caused by stress. Most stress is caused by work. Most of it is unnecessary. It does not serve a higher purpose. It is self-inflicted or inflicted by us on each other out of ignorance, out of fear, or lack of empathy, whatever it is. My next book is actually called The Healing Organization, which is exploring this idea that business can be a source and a force for healing in the world. It's not about a healing business, it's about business as healing. You can take broken people who have been burnt and hurt in the past, laid off multiple times, their families have had to go on food stamps or worse, and you can actually, through work and through business, heal them and their families and their children. There's some tremendous stories that we have of companies that have done exactly that, because they put people at the center and they want to care about their lives. So those are the four tenets. As it says, it addresses all of the big questions: the why, the what, the who, and the how. Right? We need to rethink all of these things. Examine all of us. We're living in a very momentous time of extraordinary change in a very short period. We mark in terms of endearment, 1990 as a turning point, the beginning of what we call the Age of Transcendence. And we're transcending just the purely material aspects of life and now thinking about these higher things. And a lot has changed just in that brief period of time. So many things, the Cold War ended, the internet, the World Wide Web was invented, there were a whole bunch of other things that happened, the telecom revolution, all kinds of things. So the world has changed, people are changing, we haven't adapted. We are using an operating system that is about 150 years out of date. It was in the industrial age, using the military as the organizing metaphor. We need a new operating system for business.
So let me go to some of the questions, Raj, if we may. Unless you want to, again, you mentioned pretty quickly the why, the what, the who, and the how.
Yeah.
Actually, why don't we first, you go back again, how those fit together? Because it's the thing I took away most from your book is it is about balance, it is about integration. You have to do all these things at the same time together so that you get the outcome.
And they all go together, because a conscious leader is motivated by service to people and the purpose, right? And part of that is discovering what that purpose is. All of the stakeholders are also motivated, they have shared alignment around that purpose, right? The culture is also rooted in shared values and purpose. So, you will see all of these things showing up in each of them. They're all, connected. And if you start changing one of them, you're going to start to see an impact in all those areas.
So we have a question: how should public boards manage executive compensation given the trend of CEO pay versus company performance?
Yeah. Well, okay, so a couple of things. One is executive compensation, I think a lot of us know, has risen a lot more rapidly than revenues, than profits, than shareholder wealth, and certainly than average pay. Right? That line looks like this, and average pay looks like this. And as a percentage of total profits, it's way up. Executives are taking home a lot higher percentages of the value that's being created by businesses. So I think some degree of balance there. And looking, Whole Foods has a voluntary ratio of 19:1 on highest pay to median pay. And they've chosen to adhere to that for 12 years now. Before that, it used to be 14:1. Costco was even lower than that. I think Jim Senegal's pay was $375,000. Now he owns $2 billion of stock. He's the founder. But the point is that there is, compared to most companies, there tends to be higher pay at the entry level or the ordinary, rank and file, so to speak, and somewhat modest at the top. So some sanity there. I've also I've been on compensation committees, and the tendency there is to look at what others are paying, right? There's always benchmarking. And then everybody wants to be at the 75th percentile. And it's called the Ratchet Effect, right? It's like Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average. Okay. All our leaders are above average in that sense. So, there's a ratchet effect that happens and everybody is trying to benchmark each other and then be higher than the benchmark, right? So that's the dynamic behind it. But I think the other side of it is even more important, which is what is it linked to? And I think it has to be a multi-dimensional. It cannot be just purely on financial metrics. It has to be on lead indicators. It has to be on employees and on customers and certainly on what we're doing with the environment and society and so forth. So there has to be a multi-dimensional way of assessing performance and rewarding that as well, not just purely on the numbers. Because if we say that we're about purpose and values and all the rest of it, and then our compensation is purely based upon financials, well, that's ultimately not going to work because people will just focus on that. Everything else will be discounted, that those are just empty words. So a lot of companies that are actually putting this, 50% of the compensation is based on non-financials for many of these companies. Right? And how do we measure those things and how do we benchmark them and so forth is important.
So you and I have spoken in the run-up to this about activist stockholders in public companies and how does a company engage in conscious capitalism when you've got activists, so-called activists, trying to get you to do short-term activities?
Yeah.
How does a company actually survive?
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, that's an open question. There's a lot of companies facing that challenge. Whole Foods went through that. Unilever went through that and may go through that again with 3G coming back perhaps in a few weeks. Procter & Gamble and Etsy and a bunch of others are. I think it's, and for those of you who haven't, John Mackey gave an interview to the Texas Monthly magazine. You just look for it, CEO of Whole Foods. He was very blunt and kind of brutal about it, as to what he sees happening here. A short-term investor is an oxymoron. Investing by definition is for the long term. So if somebody is in it for the short term, that's a speculator, okay? And if they're trying to use their position to make you do something that's going to cause immediate returns for them, well, that's, they're basically holding you hostage on that. How do you prevent that or protect against that? I think it really has to do with your large institutional shareholders that you have. What does it mean to treat an investor or a shareholder as a stakeholder? It means that they are part of the dialogue, they're part of the discussion. They're part of your long-term planning and strategic thinking. When Whole Foods does what they call future search every few years, right? And they bring together 500 people, employees, customers, community members, suppliers, executives, board members, et cetera, and investors, to say, what's the next stage for us? Where do we go from here? What's our collective destiny? How should we evolve? So those long-term, the true investors in that business not only are looking for the return, but they're also looking for impact and they're looking for legacy through that money. That their investment causes something to happen in the world. And if they believe that this is something that should happen, then they are loyal and they stick with. In the 2008 downturn, Whole Foods stock was about 70 around 2006. And when I met John and we had our first conference in Austin, it was at $7. Whole Foods stock was $7 in October of 2008, okay? And he seemed rather unfazed. I said, John, aren't you worried? He said, I don't know why the market is freaking out. He said, it's still the same company. And our comp stocks are down a little bit, but we'll be okay. And within 3 years, it was at 110, right? Now, T. Rowe Price, which was one of their long-term institutional investors, said, we believe in what you guys are doing. Hang in there. Okay, they weren't looking to bail or make them do some stupid things like lay off people and junk your whole strategy and just become like everybody else, right? They understood what this company is about. So I think having those close relationships with the true investors, the long-term partners in value creation that you have, I think that becomes a defense, because even if Jana comes in and acquires 8.9% of Whole Foods, that only gets you so far. Unless they can get the other institutions to buy into their vision, it's not going to lead to what they're looking for. When they wanted to sell the company to Kroger or Publix, replace the entire board, replace the leadership, lay off, thousands of people, maybe 10,000 people, right? And essentially destroy the soul of something that has taken 40 years to build, can be gone and just become just another company. There's this tendency to move towards, the sort of standard operating way. How do you run a retailer? Well, here's how you do it. All the analysts on Wall Street know how a retailer, what the ratios are supposed to be. Well, no. Every one of these businesses is unique. Costco is a great example. Jim Sinegal got so much pressure from Wall Street on several things. Why do you have to pay your employees double of Walmart and 60% higher than Sam's Club? You could get people for less. He said, I believe my people should be able to look after their families. Okay? And by the way, our turnover is 7%, Walmart is 70%, which means our people stay here for decades, right? And by the way, our labor costs, sales per employee are 3 times higher. Okay? Even though we pay double, our sales per employee are 3 times higher. Okay? So there's some legitimate things that happen when you do this. There's a wonderful book called The Good Job Strategy by a professor at MIT, Zeynep Ton, which shows how, specifically in retail, that treating people well and paying them well actually has tremendous operational consequences that then help the business compete, even in a low price environment, right?
But back to your point, you have to stay connected with the buy-side analysts that are long-term investors, the T. Rowe Prices and others. They have to really understand your purpose, understand your business, and stick with you, because Wall Street, at least at this point, I think over time Wall Street will adopt to this and you can speak better, but Wall Street has their models and they want to treat everybody in the same business the same way and fit them into the model which is going to drive you to have nice average outcomes at best. And they're going to decide. So you have to have the long term, the pension funds and the others understand your business. And you speak to that very well in your book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. Again, treating investors as real stakeholders, which means they have a voice, they have a say, they're part of the team, right? And they, you do adapt according to what's important there.
Raj, I think somebody may have read some of your book because they ask you to, can you say what's meant by spiritual intelligence under conscious leadership?
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk about all the different intelligences and why
Sure.
they're important.
Yeah, so IQ is kind of fixed at birth. Even though overall IQ is rising at 3 to 4% a decade, which is extraordinary actually. Think about it. Collective IQ of humanity is rising at 3.5 to 4% a decade for the last 8 decades, according to this guy named Flynn. Flynn Effect is called, which is extraordinary. Because if you do the compound math on that, somebody with an average IQ of 100, it gets normalized to 100 every decade, right? So the average is always 100. But if you look at the raw numbers underneath, right? Somebody with an IQ of 100 today in the year 1937 would have been at 134 IQ, which would have put them in the top 2% of intelligence. So an average person today would be considered a near genius 80 years ago, one human lifetime ago. Human capacity, human potential has never been greater. The human seed has never been more potent. But the soil remains toxic. And no seed can really flourish unless the soil is the culture, it's the values, it's the leadership, it's the organizational structure within which we operate. So IQ, but however, it's fixed, right? So, we're born with, our children are smarter than we are on average, significantly, okay? Our IQ is fixed, and of course you need higher, and all CEOs I know are very smart. In the past, that's the only thing that mattered, IQ. But as Daniel Goleman and others have shown, that ultimately in terms of happiness as well as in terms of your impact on other people and overall flourishing, emotional intelligence is even more important. And there was a study that was in the Harvard Business Review a few years ago that had a correlation between emotional intelligence and where you are in the organization. It was lowest at the CEO level. CEOs have the lowest EQ in the entire organization. And then it went up as you go down. People reporting had a slightly higher. And people reporting middle management, it kind of peaked and then it went down again, right? What it needs to be is the highest at that higher level. The person with the highest, I have not met a person with higher emotional intelligence than Herb Kelleher. Okay? You need that. And it can be cultivated. So that's the great thing. It's not that you're born with it and, I can't do it. You can actually cultivate emotional intelligence. There are ways to learn, right? How to develop that self-understanding as well as understanding of others. Spiritual intelligence is really about understanding what really drives us at a deep level. It's about understanding the role of meaning and purpose in our life. That's really, essentially that's what it boils down to, right? So almost all human beings, deep down, want to live a life of meaning and purpose. Now, many can't articulate it, and many haven't even thought about it because they're just about survival. They can't even, right? Remember, for all of human history until 200 years ago, 95% of humanity lived in abject poverty. It was all about surviving for the next day. So you couldn't think about things like purpose. But today, many more of us can, right? And human beings want to have that. And most people aren't getting that through their paid work. And therefore, people are volunteering for causes and setting up NGOs, 2 million of them in the US. They're devoting tremendous passion and energy and resources to things that matter to them. They have nothing to do with self-interest. They have everything to do with them as human beings. And that's missing from paid work. It's like saying we've got within us these two batteries, right? There's one that is driven by self-interest and the other one that is driven by purpose and the need to care. And we're telling people, don't use that battery when you come to work. This is the only one you need. The more powerful source is disconnected at work. That's what gets people to do extraordinary things. And we don't have access to that because we don't inspire people. We make it all about money and it's just a job, and we don't treat them with respect and dignity, and people are just told what to do. That's the typical work environment. So spiritual intelligence and then systems intelligence is the ability to understand that things are interconnected and interdependent. It's not a linear chain that A causes B and B causes C and C causes D and that leads to shareholder value, right? There are feedback loops and there are delayed impacts and everything is connected to everything. So we need to understand how that system as a whole operates. Otherwise, we will inevitably have the opposite impact of what we're trying to have if we don't understand how things are interconnected and interdependent. The systems thinking is severely lacking in our education system and certainly among most leaders. Some people are natural systems thinkers, but for the most part, that's really is the root of our crises that we face in the world, is the absence of systems thinking, because we have unintended consequences from actions that purely are symptomatic thinking. There's a symptom, somebody has fever, I give them Tylenol, lower the fever. Well, why did that fever happen? It's gone now, right? Well, it's going to come back. It's going to be worse, right? So unless we understand the root causes underlying, the dynamic that gives rise to, there's an underlying system that shows up, that manifests itself in these events, that we then react to. But what is that underlying system we need to understand? So those are the elements.
So, this is such a rich part of the book, and even richer just talking to Raj. But you were kind enough to put together a list, because I said we have directors here, people who advise directors. Let's look at some of the questions you thought directors should be asking.
Yeah, so here are some of the, it starts obviously with the question of purpose. At the board level, have you asked this question? Why do we exist? What is our purpose?
And do you talk about it? Does the board talk? Does management talk? It's just like safety. If the board's not hearing from the management about safety, you may not have a company that's very safe, and that's a leading indicator. If they're not able to articulate the purpose, how many of you know, I'm not going to ask you to raise hands, but how many of you know whether or not your company has a stated purpose, and do you ever hear about it as a board member?
Right, and again, this assessment will help look at that question, right? So why do we exist? Why do we need to exist? And why would we be missed if we disappear tomorrow is probably the most important question. Who would miss us and why? We're a bank, there's 600 other banks in town. Yeah, it's gone. I have to go 2 blocks further now to go to a branch, but yeah. So Circuit City went away. Yeah. Best Buy showed up in that same spot 2 years later. I'm good. There's no grief over the lapse and loss of many businesses, Because if you don't have a purpose, then there's no void. What kind of hole are you leaving in the world? There's something unique that you can do. Okay? There's an impact that you can have. Now, one dimension I didn't touch upon earlier, which I learned, I did a book 2 years ago called Everybody Matters, in a company called Barry Wehmiller, which is an industrial machinery manufacturing company, mostly packaging machinery. And Bob said, Raj, I have a tough time finding a higher purpose. People don't get excited to come to work and make a machine that makes toilet paper. It's kind of hard. So he said, our purpose is our people. He said, we measure success by the way we touch the lives of people. That is our purpose. We just want to elevate the lives of these people living in these little towns in Wisconsin and Ohio, which are dying, and those businesses were struggling, and we buy them and we turn them around, and now suddenly the town of Phillips, Wisconsin, population 1,500, 600 work at our company. Now this town is vibrant again. It was looking at getting wiped off the face of the map, right? So their purpose is their people. So I started to realize there's a duality here in purpose. It's like a plane with 2 engines. There's a people-centered purpose and a product-centered purpose. What are you trying to do in the world through your business? But also, what are you trying to do for people? Starting with your own people and their families. One of the big ahas I had a few weeks ago in Atlanta in the launch of our chapter there, the CEO of a consulting company called JBN, he said, I came from McKinsey and I started this consulting company. One of the things I really wanted to change was this culture in consulting that you have to be away Monday to Thursday every week at a client site, right? And that's pretty much the norm. And he said, my kids grew up and I barely saw them. And that was too high a price to pay. And so I'm going to create a consulting company where all our clients are local. You don't have to travel. And our families are actually our stakeholders. Families are separately from the employee. They're also stakeholders. And having those children be able to see their parent regularly is important, right? And so they're taking away a source of silent suffering, which most people say, I'm in consulting, that's what we have to do. We have to sacrifice that. Well, that never comes back. That's too high a price to pay, right? So again, we have to be aware of those things. So the people-centered purpose and a product-centered purpose. There are companies that have a noble purpose in the world, and yet they mistreat their people. And they have a tough place to, it's a tough place to work. That's not acceptable. If you had to pick one of those engines, I would say pick the people engine. Everybody can do that. Everybody has people. You can find your purpose in your people. And when you do that, you'll find a purpose in the product as well, because you'll start doing more interesting things in the world. Because you take care of the people will take care of the business. Are we paying enough attention to those other stakeholders? Are all of our reports and everything that we see all about the numbers, and that's kind of a rear view mirror, right? What happened last quarter, last year, et cetera, and then there's some speculation about our plans. But yeah, what's happening with our customers? What's happening with employee engagement? What's happening with the Net Promoter Score, right? What's happening with our suppliers? Are we getting the best suppliers? Well, that matters a lot. How are we viewed in the community? All of the stakeholder measures we need, right, to be monitoring at the board level, because they are leading indicators. Everything else is kind of a lagging indicator of what happened. This is going to tell you what's going to happen. If our people are passionate and committed and engaged, well, in the future, that's going to show up, right? Even though we may be going through a cyclical downturn right now. So.
There's a great discussion in the book about suppliers and the importance.
Which is growing. More and more companies now rely on suppliers for a larger percentage of the total value that they present to their customers. So suppliers matter a great deal, right? And most companies kind of treat them as stepchildren. Do we track leading indicators? Yeah, so that's kind of the same thought, right? I just mentioned that. Those are two of the stakeholders. Culture. Very few boards, I think, pay attention to culture. And they think it really doesn't matter. I think it matters tremendously. And there are some wonderful tools. Because people think, oh, it's so nebulous, like what can you even do about it? Well, there's a wonderful tool like we use a lot called the Ballot Cultural Values Audit. Literally within a day, you can get a snapshot of your culture. You can understand what are the things that people are experiencing versus what are the things that they would like to experience versus what are the things that you say your culture is about. Okay? And you can get a measure of overall cultural entropy, the amount of disharmony in the system that exists. You can also map those values that exist on 7 levels of consciousness. And ultimately, a conscious business reflects full spectrum consciousness. It's not about moving up to meaning and purpose and service to humanity. It also means being efficient and effective and having all the foundational elements, the blocking and tackling of business has to be in place, right? You can't just be about the higher. So you need a full spectrum. You need everything from making sure we have efficient processes and accountability and all of that, all the way up to meaning and purpose and service to humanity. Can we have all of that in our culture? That is a full spectrum culture. And there are some very good, as I said, relatively easy tools that enable us to assess that. And you can then take snapshots periodically, and then you can know exactly what needs to be done to get to where we want to be. And I think perhaps most importantly, are we selecting the right leaders with the right set of qualities? I think Alan mentioned that earlier, right? It's people are very slick and very good at conveying, telling you what you want to hear. But are there ways that we can truly assess that, right? And are we getting an individual who truly, and again, there are some questions on this sheet as well that ask those kinds of things. Is this a leader? Because something that took us decades to build can be destroyed within a couple of years by the wrong leader. It has happened time and again, okay? And so very, very critical responsibility of the board, perhaps the most important, is to make sure that you're putting the right leaders in place. And if you make a mistake, walk away from it quickly. One of the things some of our leaders have told us, if we had to do it over again, we would hire more slowly and fire more quickly. Okay. Now, most of us do the opposite. We hire quickly and then fire slowly. Right? We hire I'm not just talking about at the CEO, any level. We hire people and then, they're not the good fit. It's not aligned with their values and their purpose, and they're unhappy and they're unproductive, and then it takes years and years and years. You're not serving them. If you make a mistake, recognize it early and move on. You're doing them a service too. There's a better fit somewhere else for them. So.
Raj, as I said, we could talk at least all day about this. This is a great book. You all have a benefit I didn't have. I bought the hardcover, though, and you'll get the softcover. But I do promote reading this because it's hard, even reading the book, to touch on how deep these thoughts are and follow Raj's other work. I'm sorry I didn't get to ask all the questions. I'll give those to Raj so he doesn't know what the questions were.
Could I say one last thing before? So we do have a local chapter. We have chapters now in about 30 U.S. cities and 13 other countries. And we have a great chapter here in Houston. Where's Bethany? Bethany Andel, if you look back there. So Bethany runs our Houston chapter. I believe you have an event on September 19th coming up, right? So if you go to consciouscapitalism.org, you can find out information about all of this if you are interested.
And again, thank Brent Necker for giving us this. Thank you, Raj. Thank you.